After the death of Moses, God said to Joshua, his chosen leader, "Now that Moses is dead, you will lead my people into the promised land. Be strong and of good courage, Joshua. Do not be afraid, for I, the Lord, will be with you wherever you go." What a promise that was that God made to him. But before they could enter the land, there was this town, one of the very first towns they would come to after they crossed the Jordan River. And that town, or that city, was called Jericho. And it had a huge wall all around it that was right inside the border of Canaan. And so Joshua called together some of his spies, 2 special spies, and he called them over to him as they were camped along just on the edge of Canaan. And he called 2 of his spies, and he said, "I want you two to sneak into Jericho and spy out the land." Now, many years ago, 40 years before, was when Joshua and Caleb had spied out the land, remember, of Canaan, and they found those huge grapes, and they said, "We could go in, but there were these giants in the land." Well, Joshua told his 2 spies to go in to Jericho and check it out and see how strong the city was. Well, the men pretended to be just ordinary travelers, and they went on that long journey over to Jericho to just see what it was like in there. And as they got into Jericho, they pretended to be just ordinary travelers and check things out. And they found a woman named Rahab. And they stayed with this woman named Rahab. But their arrival reached the king of Jericho. And he'd been watching this camp outside of Jericho and seeing all these people. Remember, there were over 1 million people. There were a lot of people. And he was getting nervous. And he said, the king's men noticed the 2 spies. And they rushed to the king and they said, "Some Israelites are here spying on the city. They're at Rahab's house." Oh no. These kings sent some men to arrest the spies. And when they reached Rahab's house, they were banging on the front door shouting, "The king demands that you bring out the 2 spies that are staying with you. We know they're spies." And the Israelites, of course, thought they were trapped and it was to their doom. But Rahab was calling them. And she said, "Go on my roof." And she took him to the roof of her house. And there were these stalks of flax. Flax is kind of like wheat. And it's kind of tall. And it was like almost like a big pile of wheat that is called flax. And it was up there to dry. Their roofs were flat. And so there was big stalks of things drying. And she said, "You lie down and I'll cover you up with these stalks of flax." So she covered them up, and no one would ever have guessed they were there. They were completely hidden. And then she hurried downstairs to open the door to the king's men, and she said, "Yes, there were 2 men, but they just left. If you hurry, you should be able to catch them." And the soldiers said, "They'll probably went down by the river to go back to their camp." So they set off to run and find the spies. But the spies were up on the roof of the house, laying there so still. And soon Rahab returned. And the 2 men were so surprised that she was willing to risk her life for them. And she said, why did you risk your life for us?" And she said, "I will tell you why. I know the Lord has promised you this land, and most of my people are afraid of your people. We've heard how God divided the sea for you and brought you through the wilderness all those years ago, 40 years ago from when you left Egypt. And when you attack this city, and we know that God is with you, promise me that you will save my life and the life of my family." And the men agreed to that. They said, "All right, when we come into Jericho, we will save you and your family." So by then it was nighttime, and the gates of the city were shut. And there was when they shut the gates of the city, then you couldn't get out and the enemies couldn't get in. But her house was on the edge of the wall. So she brought a rope And she tied it to the window of her house, and she pulled the rope all the way down to the ground, and the men were able to climb down from the rope. So she saved their lives. So they escaped to the mountains. And then she said, why don't you hide there in the mountains for 3 days until the search is over? So before the spies left, they agreed they would run into the mountains, but they said, when we need you to tie a scarlet cord or a red rope out of your window so we know it's your house. So everybody will know not to attack your house from a distance. And then anybody inside of your house would be saved. Oh my goodness, what an amazing thing. So when Joshua and the spies returned when the spies returned to Joshua, they told him all about what happened to them. And they said, God, we know God will be with us. But boy, they shared about Rahab and how they barely escaped with their lives, but how Rahab helped. So Joshua, of course, also promised to take care of them, or take care of Rahab. Well, the next day, it was time to go in. But there's a river that blocked them. And of course, the spies were able to get across, but how are they going to get all those thousands and thousands of people across this river? The Jordan River was there. And on the other side of the river, far off in the distance, was Jericho. So Joshua trusted God, and he knew that God would tell him what to do. So the priests were going to carry the ark. Now remember, the priests were God's chosen men, and they were going to take care of the Ark of the Covenant. Remember the Ark of the Covenant, a special box that had the 10 Commandments in it. And it also had Aaron's rod that budded. And they covered the Ark. And only the priests were allowed to touch the Ark. And Joshua said, the priests must go first. And then as the people would get near the river, an amazing thing happened. The priests marched up to the river, and as soon as their toes touched the water parted, just like it had when they left Egypt. The water separated, and then all of the people were able to walk right across the river, just like they did the Nile River when they left Egypt. It was a miracle. So the priests stood on dry ground in the middle of the river, and they waited until all the people crossed across to the other side. And before the priests left the river, Josh called 12 men, and he said, bring some boulders out of the river. This would prove that they walked on that dry ground. They grabbed some rocks that were at the bottom of that river, and they stacked them onto the shore. And then when they made kind of an altar on the side of the shore, and they stacked these 12 rocks, one for each tribe. And they said, when your children grow up and they wonder what these rocks are for, tell them, this is to remind us that God brought us across the river into the promised land, because the Jordan River is what divided them from the promised land. So it was done. And as soon as the priests came up out of the river, the water that had piled up just went right back as before, and the river started flowing smoothly. So God showed the people that he was with Joshua just as he was with Moses all those years before. A very similar miracle happened. The water parted, and it was such a wonderful thing that the people knew they could have faith and trust Joshua to be their leader, and that God was with them, and he was going to give them their promised land. Isn't that wonderful? And you know, God is with us too. And we can claim that same promise that Joshua got. Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, for I, the Lord, will be with you wherever you go. And when we have Jesus in our heart, it's just like he was with Joshua. He will be with us wherever we go.